Welcome to my channel. This is the Canon EOS 300V. It's a consumer level camera which was released in 2002. The styling seems to be a big improvement on the previous EOS 300, but it's a bit like Marmite. You either love it or hate it. It's incredibly cheap. I bought this one on eBay for £14, which is about $18. You turn the camera on using this dial on the top. Along here are the creative modes. Program, where the camera sets the shutter speed and the aperture. Shutter priority, where you set the shutter speed and the camera sets the aperture. Aperture priority, where you set the aperture and the camera sets the shutter speed. Manual, where you set both. And there's depth of field program, where the sensors in the viewfinder check which is the nearest and farthest points in the subject and sets both the aperture and the shutter speed and the focus to keep them all in focus. Down here is basic mode. You've got full auto, portrait, landscape, close-up, sports, night portrait and flash off. I took this picture using night portrait mode. The background is exposed correctly while the subject in the foreground is lit by flash. Whenever Canon released a consumer level camera, they usually allowed many of the high level features from their advanced cameras to trickle down. So this camera has 7 autofocus points you can see here, and you can choose which one to use via this button on the back. So you can have that focus point there, that one, top, middle, bottom, right or further right, and then you set it here and the camera will choose which focus point to use. So you might want to use single center point for portraits, allowing you to pinpoint focus on the nearest eye. The flash provides a focus detect beam for low light. Manual focus can be achieved by flipping this switch on the lens and you move it back to autofocus like that. The Canon lens range is quite vast, and Canon got the design right when they redesigned their lens mount in the 1980s. Everything made from 1987 through to 2019 will fit, apart from the EFS crop lenses, which are for crop digital cameras only. There are many independent lenses available also, at quite good prices. The viewfinder is clear and bright, giving all the relevant exposure information. The AF points can be seen and the relevant one lights up to show which has been used to focus. Along the bottom you can see exposure lock, flash ready, shutter speed, aperture and the scale to show either exposure compensation or manual metering. Last is the focus confirmation light. The metering is very well thought out. Evaluative metering, where the meter reads from 35 parts of the image, is standard and used for all of the auto exposure modes. It switches to partial metering mode when you use the auto exposure lock on the back of the camera here, if perhaps you have a really light background and you don't want the subject underexposed. Center weighted is used when manual is selected. This is the perfect configuration for me and is similar to what I use with my Nikon F801, but I have to press a few buttons to achieve this with the Nikon. On the back of the camera is the focus point select and the exposure lock. There's an LCD for you to set all of the camera functions. This button allows you to set the aperture when you're in manual mode. When you're in one of the auto modes, it allows you to set exposure compensation. The function button allows you to change the ISO. When you first load a film, the DX coding sets the exposure. So you'll have to come into this screen here if you want to change the ISO. You can also change red eye reduction with the flash. You can turn off the annoying beeper. You can set multiple exposures. And you can set auto bracket, which is a strange feature to have on a beginner camera, but I think that's probably because it's quite easy to just add it through software. This button sets the film advanced mode. You can have single shot, auto wind, which is 2.5 frames per second, which is quite good for a beginner camera, or the self timer. Loading film is easy. Pull this button down, open the back, put the cassette in here, pull the film leader all the way to there. When you close the back, the film is advanced all the way through to the last frame. As you take a picture, each time it's wound back into the cassette after each photo. That way, if you accidentally open the camera back, you won't lose any of your photographs. This is the mid-roll rewind button. If you want to wind the film back into the cassette before you finish the film, just press this and it'll wind all the way back into the cassette for you. On the bottom is the tripod mount. This is the battery cover. Inside here you can see you have two CR2 batteries. They're not the sort of batteries that you'll find in the shops. You'll have to order them online. If you want to use a cable release, you'll have to use a special one that plugs in just here. It's called the RS60 E3 and costs about £10. There's another release called the RC1 infrared. That costs about £7, but it can only be used if you have the date version of the camera. Just below the lens release mount is the depth of field preview. You press that and you can get an approximation of the depth of field for the aperture that you've set. The built-in flash has a guide number of 12 in meters, which is reasonably powerful. Flash output is measured through the lens, so you can use it as fill-in flash, as I did with this picture of Cleo. Unfortunately, you can't turn the flash ratio down from full burst, so it's not as usable as it would be with a more advanced camera. You can use any external flash that's compatible with Canon's ETTL flash system. These are a little more expensive on eBay compared to Minolta or Nikon equivalents. However, they're very capable flashes and they're quite powerful. You can use third-party flash triggers together with a flash meter, as I did here with my Yongnuo kit. Sometimes wireless triggers introduce a delay, so you might find part of the frame cut off due to the focal plane shutter not being fully open as the flash fires. Although the flash sync speed is a 90th of a second on the Canon, I used a 45th of a second to avoid cut-off, and this seems to work fine. There are a number of cameras getting a vast amount of love on YouTube, such as the Minolta X700, Canon AE1 and the Pentax K1000. This has driven up prices for some very old cameras. For instance, I bought my Nikon FE 10 years ago for £50, but sold it last month for £250. However, more recent plastic fantastic cameras give you much greater functionality, much more sophisticated metering, and they're as cheap as chips. They're not as old and have electronically timed metal shutters, so they have fewer problems. The Canon EOS 300V is an inexpensive compact camera which allows you to use the extensive range of Canon lenses. It feels a little flimsy, but the camera is over 20 years old and working perfectly, so it's actually sturdier than it looks. The functionality is extensive and shows how advanced 35mm SLRs became during their last days. I thoroughly recommend this camera if you want to get into film photography. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.